if anyone wants to share anything or talk about anything particular, you can, yeah, put your hand up. There is a way of putting your hand up. All right. Okay, Henry.
Mike, I had a question. I've been listening to your 2019, the 12 sessions that you released. And in there, when you talk about the tree of life, could you kind of maybe unpack that a little bit further? I've been looking at that, some of the diagrams, and one of the things that I'm kind of intrigued by is that it looks like it's kind of more of a dimensional type of a thing. So when you look at the kind of the simple rendering of it, there's so many houses, but if you were to consider that in a multi-dimensional type of a deal, there's houses that are behind the houses, and I'm trying to kind of work this out, and I'd kind of appreciate hearing some of your ideas about this.
Okay, I mean, I think what you're describing is probably where I would come from in it as well. I find that things that we engage with have multiple levels of encounter. And when you see something, usually you see it as a representation that we connect to in the physical realm. So the tree of life, it's a tree, and there's fruit on the tree, and also attached to that tree, there's leaves for the healing of the nations and whatever. So we tend to think of it from this perspective as a tree. Now, we know it's a spiritual thing, not just a physical thing. What I've found is I've engaged with it as a tree, and I've eaten the fruit from the tree, and I've engaged the scrolls from there, and I've gone through that, following the tree of river of life beyond it. And that seemed to be a sort of spiritual location within the realms of heaven, attached to Eden, the garden of God. And so I had all those sort of experiences, which were great. And, as I ate the fruit of the tree, I was empowered by what I was eating, very, very, very sort of, an encounter base. But as I then began to connect to sort of realms of heaven being sort of dimensions and dimensional things, and the governmental aspect of who we are in that realm, I found that there were wheels within wheels within wheels, if you like. So there were deeper levels. And so then I began to sense and feel, as I engaged the tree of life, that it was, from my identity perspective, that I had a place within it. That within the tree of life, we all have places. That we are, as children of God, have places within that we... our being is, and we were probably aware of that more before we came here in our spiritual being, before we came into this physical realm, and it seemed to have gateways or points of intersection or places where I just found, well, I belong in this place, that made connections. And I think that's to do with light and sound and frequency, because, we are a physical being and we're a spirit being, but we also carry the nature of God, and therefore we carry something of a frequency, a fragrance, a sound, a song, light, all these things which are a little bit less tangible, but are actually none less real. And so I think there's sort of depths of engaging the tree of life, which means that there are positions within it that are access points dimensionally, and also places of being where we connect to creation and are part of the light that is to engage creation, and the sound that's creates creation, to ultimately bring it into a harmonious place. And therefore, one of the pictures that sort of sacred geometry draws for the tree of life is a sort of, a long tube with two pointy bits on the end, on each end. I can't remember what the actual name of it is, but essentially a geometric shape, which then you get pictures of that, and you get sort of sacred geometric shapes that are contained within the Metatron's cube overall shape. And all these things relate. It's a little bit sort of out there for most people who are, learning to engage in Eden or the garden of their heart and stuff. But nonetheless, I think at a deeper level, we are connected to it and we do have access to it. And when we begin to, I think, get our minds, our consciousnesses sort of expanded to begin to encompass who we really are, in God's intention and his heart, then we begin to reconnect to it. And I don't have sort of details of it. Most of it is more being there and feeling and sensing that I'm in a place which connects things or connects realms or dimensions or various things like that. But I think it's worth, engaging when you're obviously looking to pursue it. I throw things out there, in my encounters just because it stimulates some people to go and pursue, and for other people, it's like straight over the top of their head, just didn't register or resonate at all. And as these things resonate with you, pursue it. And I'm sure you'll probably go deeper into those things than I have, because that's the reason I put it out there, because some people will be mandated to go deeper, and will probably come back and say, hey, I experienced this, or this is what it really meant for me, or this place, was a place of, dimensional intersection. And I think all those diagrams have like spheres where points meet. And I think those spheres are actually that, spheres of authority or position that we're in and our being is connected to, and therefore they engage multiple dimensions. So, because a point is in one fixed place. But if that point is surrounded by a sphere, then that sphere has access to beyond the flat structure. Because when you look at the Metatron's cube structure or the Tree of Life structure, it's always drawn flat, because that's the only way you can draw something on a flat piece of paper. But it's drawn with perspective that seems to have multiple things. There's a cube, and then there are different shapes geometrically that seem to come out of the flat structure. And each of them seems to have a sphere of connection that I think when you're within, accesses in and out of multiple dimensions, not just the flat of what we see when we try and draw it. So when you go into it, it opens things up. I think that's as much as I really have to be able to describe cognitively, because I think some of the experiences are beyond my ability to yet explain them. But it's just okay, because maybe later I might be able to, or maybe I won't, but I'm still engaging it. And I think there's so much more, from a Hebrew perspective, they sort of said that, each word or something has four layers of meaning, the obvious, and then there's the sort of less obvious, and then there's the cryptic, the mystical, and some would say that each one of those is 70 different dimensions to them, which is like, that's a lot, which is why we can get overwhelmed sometimes when we, I think, try and fathom it out with our minds rather than engaging it with our spirit and allowing our spirit to receive whatever it needs to receive from the engagement, and then from there that then gets released. And eventually you find that some of the experiences spiritually you have that you cannot really understand become revelation that's cognitively unveiled, and you then begin to understand it. So I would say, my experience with the Tree of Life is on 2 or 3 different levels, and I understand the first one a lot, the second one a little bit, and beyond not that much. But I know I've encountered it, so I know there's something real in it, as much as I could really say on it. Yeah.
Well,
okay.
thank you.
Yeah, okay. All right, Adina, you got your hand up there.
Yeah, I just had a question about frequencies. Watched a session that you did, and you talked about the 3, 6, and 9, and the 4, 3, 2. But we're in a circle of Christians that are really excited about 444, the Key of David, and things like that. And I just wondered if you could address um, the differences or what your thoughts are on that.
Um, Now, if my friend Dell Hungerford were here, she would be able to go into all the depths of that. And if you can Google her and her website, she's a classical musician and really understands a lot about frequency and stuff. And some of what was put out there as solfeggio frequencies and this being the hidden frequencies within the Bible really isn't. But that's not to say that some of those frequencies are not does carry with them some dimension which brings healing or wholeness. I mean, she's done some music on the resurrection frequency, which I think is 704 or something like that. 528 is often seen as a healing frequency. I mean, I have, we use the sort of crystal bowls that are tuned to 444. Therefore, C would be 528. And generally, it's the A, which I think is tuned to a particular frequency. Concert frequency 430. Our musicians, I think, retuned theirs to 432. But the bowls we bought were 444 because we wanted one of them to have a sort of healing frequency. And I think I've got that bowl here somewhere, which is that frequency. So, and that's a variant of 528. So now what I found is that we all carry a frequency. We all vibrate effectively. That's literally what it's saying. All energy is vibrating, and the whole of creation is vibrating, and the planet has a frequency. It's called Schumann's frequency. And over the last year or so, that has increased. There have been spikes of increase. And I think some of that is because the sons of God are beginning to actually radiate their frequency and beginning to connect, so that creation is resonating with us in our sonship and responding with a raised frequency. So when it comes to healing, you have different frequencies that are operating within the body. And when those frequencies are low, then it's an indication of sickness or disease, malaise of some sort. And people are learning to apply frequencies to the body to raise those frequencies up. Now, essential oils is probably the most popular one. Essential oils carrying a sort of high frequency and then being applied to the body, or being in sort of smelt or things like that, that seem to be having a positive effect. But what I've found is when I use frequency in terms of sound or using a crystal bowl, it's the intent that I release, which is the key. I mean, it's the same with laying hands on the sick and seeing them recover. Well, I imagine when you lay hands on someone to administrate healing, it will be very different than the intent you had to pat someone's back or shake someone's hand or just do something normal, but you might touch somebody, but the intent will be very different. So although the hand's the same and what you're touching is the same, your intent in what you do to engage that is different. And so I think when you engage something actively, you begin to generate a vibration, which we would call an anointing, energy, power. And when you touch somebody, that gets imparted, or they feel it, they sense it, sometimes through heat. When I've laid hands on people in the past, they've sort of thought, wow, your hands are really hot. Well, they weren't hot before I actually engaged it, but something, which is what vibration does, doesn't it? If you have friction between two things and you rub two sticks together, the point of friction creates heat because it starts to vibrate the molecules, atoms of the material until they actually start to get hot. They're vibrating. And I think when you lay hands on someone with intent, you can sometimes have electricity, sometimes various things happen. Your hand shakes, and I think all that is frequency. It's just your hand starts to vibrate. Literally within everything there are energy strings that are vibrating, which are actually the grace of God, which is the divine enabling power of God, which you could say is the residue of the speaking creation into being, which is held together by the voice of his power. So that's energy, which holds everything together and is vibrating. Now it's in everything. Now you can't see it, and most scientists will say most of what we see is empty space in reality, but actually it is there, and it's the building blocks of everything and holds all things together. But you can connect to it because that power can vibrate in your hands and enable you to administrate healing, because it's the power of his voice. It's the continual vibrational frequency of his creative act that we can connect to as his sons and begin to administrate. So there is that aspect of it. I think, the key of David, all of those things, you'll find a lot of people start talking about stuff that when you really delve into it, it's a little bit like they're passing on the latest information, but they don't really have deep insight into what it means. So there was some stuff out a while ago on solfeggio's frequencies, and there were some well-known people who were doing sessions on it online and YouTube and things. But when you really delve into it, you find, although there's truth in what they're saying, it isn't actually true what they're saying. So, if you know what I mean. And I think you just be in anything, like, we need to be discerning and not just gullibly accept what everyone's saying without engaging God about it and actually having the discernment to know what is the truth, what is an element of truth, and what is just sort of the latest pop culture thing that everyone's using to say, hey, we're into frequency, and we're into this and that and the other. Now, I totally know, having experimented using, for us, crystal bowls and sound, that the intent that's released can be felt and experienced because it's carried on the wave of the sound. It's like light can carry information. We call it fiber optic. Something is passed along the light that's information. And that information, if you're thinking of fiber optics as in the internet, would carry lots of information, which the computer sort of distinguishes and turns into information, or your TV does, and you get to watch Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever else you might watch as a streaming thing that's effectively coming along fiber optic cable and eventually some copper cable. If you're unlucky enough not to have fiber optic right up to your door, you get this really fast speed that all of a sudden comes down to this bottleneck, and it's like, and that's the way it is for a lot of people. But it's all carried on that, information is carried on the energy, the electricity, whatever is being passed down those cables, signals, electrical impulses. And the same is true when we release a intent that carries on a frequency. So I could release an intent with my mind, and my mind might be able to radiate around me a few feet that possibly someone could connect to, and I might be connected to them. And you could see that could be potentially, I could read people's thoughts. And how did Jesus know the thoughts and intentions of people's hearts? Well, in some way he was connecting to them, and he was close enough to be able to discern. Now, our heart and can go 10 to 12 feet. And so you get the heart-to-heart connection, which you can discern attitudes and pick up things, most people don't know how to do it, but they can, but we do. And I think we can learn to do that more effectively. So we did some exercises in which we got someone to play some sounds using a bowl and release an intent. They didn't tell us what the intent was, and the rest of us in the room, and we were indifferent. Some of us were closer, some of us were further away, because we just thought we were going to experiment and see whether proximity makes a difference or whatever. But all of us heard the sound and we felt it vibrate in us, because it does. And when you sort of hit these sort of things, the sound vibrates in the bowl and it sort of resonates and goes round, and it sort of goes in you and around you and sort of carries something. And virtually everybody picked up the intent that people were using. Now, they used different words, but the sentiment was the same. Someone released the intent of peace, and someone felt tranquil, someone felt calm, someone felt resting. They all sensed something of what that intent was. So I know from that sort of experimental use that there is something that's carried on the sound that you release as you play it. Now, when I first had one, someone gave me one when I was in Seattle 2 years ago, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I felt really self-conscious and awkward and didn't know what I was doing. But I had to get over that, and I just decided, okay, I'm not going to think about what I'm doing. I'm just going to let my spirit direct me what to do. I'm not going to try and mentally decide I'm going to move the butt this way or that way, or I'm just going to do whatever comes naturally, because it's like being led. And I did. And then I felt so much more connected to it and able then to release intent. And although some people find it quite intense, and what we found in that is often that's because there's a lack of that frequency in their body, or there's something missing that needs to be imparted. And sometimes that can create wow, that's really intense. Well, someone else is saying, wow, that's a really nice sound. And it's subjective to the listener or the person who's feeling it, depending on what's going on. And sometimes that can hit up against something which causes this intense sort of almost pain that people get, in their head. And sometimes I think it's because it's hitting into a lack of that frequency, and then, people can embrace it and receive it if they're willing to push through oh, I don't like this, or this is really intense, So I think, there's a lot I think God is unveiling. There are frequency generators. There are people who talk about rife machines generating particular frequencies that have, no one has done scientific studies on these things. And this is the problem. They may work. People don't know how they work, which we don't need to know how they work. But then there can be all sorts of claims for doing things which may not work. And so if you're going to say this works and you want a scientific study, you've got to do enough scientific studies to rule out randomness. Because people will say, oh, well, that was just random. If it only happens once, next time it might not happen. And so you have to do enough to form statistical analysis, which actually can say beyond the sort of statistical analysis thing that this is actually accurate. And, I haven't got time to do that because and I don't need to, because I know what works and I know what doesn't. But I can't say scientifically, and we couldn't say in any shape this produces healing if we were going to do that publicly, in a sense of, well, we're having a healing meeting and this is going to heal you, because you will run into problems with advertising standards and all sorts of things that nowadays are really hot on this sort of thing. So you've got to be careful what you say and how you say it. But I do believe that it is positive. It does affect. And we have, lots of testimonies. A friend, we've got a guy who was in our therapeutic community who was recovering from substance abuse, had numbness all down the side of his body, possibly through substance misuse in the past, but he'd had it for years, and his whole side of his body felt numb. Well, we were, using the bowls, and I was using the bowl, the C bowl, and released a healing frequency, and he got healed. And he testified the next week that the numbness had all gone. So in that instance, there's a testimony of somebody, but that isn't a scientific study. Now, when you come to people using fragrant oils and various things, you get Young Living oils, and you get Datura and all these different things. There are some people who are using pieces of technology to test you, to see which oils you need and which things you're lacking. And they'll then get you to buy this oil or that oil. I did do some research into those pieces of equipment because, I come from a scientific background. I've used technology, and I've used technology. I worked in a laboratory, so I understand, what you need to do to use these things. And I didn't feel good about it. It just felt, I'm not sure that and I said, well, what did you do? Oh, well, we just put our hand in this thing and our palm rested on this thing. Did it feel anything? No, not really. Maybe a little tingle or whatever. Now, all that piece of equipment is a galvanometer, which effectively measures electrical charge in your hand. And I asked the last person I was talking to about this, because she had this test done, and they told her she needed these 5 oils or whatever, which are very expensive. They're not cheap. So I said to her, well, have you done a repeat test to see whether it's made any difference? And she said, well, they don't do that. So, well, why not? If it works, what's the problem with retesting the next time you engage to see, has it increased this, that, and the other? And she said, no, I suggested that, but she said, oh, no, we don't do that. So that sort of, for me, set some alarm bells ringing into whether this, and I'm not saying the person was in any way doing anything wrong, but they may have been using this thinking that it works without ever doing any studies to find out how it works themselves. For me, if I would to have a piece of equipment like that, I would test myself 10 times a day, and I would just see, without doing anything, to see whether it was consistent during the day within, the fact that the morning and, things change, but it's pretty much, does it say that you need the same oils? Does it say that this is the problem? This area of your body is the problem? Well, they don't do that. And so I looked up someone who did. So I found a medical guy who tested it on himself for 2 weeks. And he found that it was totally random. Statistically, it was totally random. He tested it once and it said he needed this. The next time he tested, an hour later, it said he needed something else, and that was okay. So I'm not saying that God can't inspire someone to discern, hey, this oil would be good for your situation, but I would not use the technology that's out there. And there's, I can't remember what they're called, Zyto somethings or whatever. There's 2 or 3 of them. And the one that Young Living recommends, I did some research, and it is just nonsense, basically. Doesn't work. But it's being sold, and it's quite expensive, and people are having tests and paying for the tests and then buying oils on the basis of this test, and it's actually completely random. So be discerning on these things. I'm not saying that oils aren't good. My wife is doing a course and training to use the oils. She uses them a lot, and I like the smells of them. Some of them, they're quite fragrant and quite nice, but I wouldn't be using a piece of equipment to try and determine what oil based on some electrical charge in your hand, which is pretty much random. No. The danger is then people then associate oils with this equipment, and then it's essentially, someone basically does the test and says, well, this is just random. And then they throw the whole baby out with the bathwater and say, this is just a whole load of people, a whole lot of hogwash, there's no credibility to it. And the reality is there is no credibility to the piece of equipment, but that doesn't mean there isn't credibility to fragrant oils or frequencies, which can be helpful in bringing us into a place of peace. Meditation, sometimes the sound just enables you to come to a place where you rest. Okay? And, no one would have a problem with a piece of music. Yeah, we play this piece of music. This piece of music is a peaceful piece of music. You wouldn't play, Deep Purple or Black Sabbath or something if you wanted to meditate, generally. So you would generally play something which was melodic, So, yeah. I'm not saying frequencies and these things aren't okay, but be careful. You just don't accept everything everyone says as being all true when it might not necessarily be all true, although there is truth in it. So, okay, where are we? Who's got their hand up? Okay. Yep.
As always, it seems like the church is behind times. The New Agers certainly have been out with some of this for a long time. I suppose the caution would be that if we just look at the mechanical side, it'd be easy to sidestep the fact that we all always go through Christ. And I know we do. What you're discussing, we always do, but that's always in the back of the mind of when we're talking about this, or especially in the church world. We talk about, sounds and frequencies and oils. That's been pretty popular among the world for, several decades now.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I agree. I mean, and I think, just because something has been used inappropriately and potentially counterfeited doesn't mean that there isn't a true that it's been counterfeited. But that doesn't mean that everything everyone does necessarily has something true behind it. And that's where you've got to be careful that you don't just assume, oh, this is being counterfeited by the New Age, so it must have a true thing in God. It doesn't necessarily have to. They have done some things which do not necessarily all find the truth in what we would say an intent that God engaged. So although I'm very happy for oils and frequencies of sound and sound bowls and crystal things and tuning forks and various things that produce frequency, I'm also aware that we do need to be discerning, and everything we do must be, as you say, with the intent that is inspired by the Spirit and not just coming out of our own intention or what we would like to do. But, I think we just got to take everything back to God and ask him, seek him for his revelation and truth. And let's not throw babies out with bathwater, but let's be discerning and let's make sure we're open to what God is doing. Now, I believe potentially that this is just an interim thing until we're functioning, in the fullness of our sonship, in which we can produce frequency through what we say, what we're doing, generating energy to bring healing or transformation or transmutation or everything else. How did Jesus turn water into wine? He must have changed the actual component of the matter to be different matter. Now, it wasn't magic. He knew what he was doing because he created it all. And he does want us to do those things. So it would make it easier if we also understood how things work as his children. He didn't want us to keep us in the dark. He wants to unveil and give us the insight into some of these things. But you do get people, obviously, who get the wrong end of the stick, or just, come from a religious perspective because it's different, it's new, and they find it awkward. I remember, when I put the Vision Destiny thing out, I used the bowls quite a lot. I used the bowls when I did declarations. I used the bowls for calling the Joshua generation to arise, for the sons of God to arise, a lot, because I know what I'm doing. One of the first comments was, "Oh, what's with all these sounds? Is this Hindu or Buddhist?" Because immediately it triggers in people this religious spirit thing that is unfamiliar with any of it. Therefore, it must be Buddhist, Hindu, New Age, or whatever. And in reality, if I'd played a piece of guitar music or a harp, they would have had no issue with it because, well, David played a harp and he, soothed Saul. So they find it in the Bible. It's okay to do that, but it isn't okay just to produce a sound, which is no different than playing one note, other than that actually it produces a purer note and it produces a resonant frequency that carries further than just plucking a string of a guitar. So I do think there is, the need for discernment, but also not skepticism or cynicism either in it. And I think we'll find that there is more to a lot of these things than we currently understand. And hopefully that revelation will get unveiled and we'll be in a place where we'll know what to do with all this in a more clear way. So there we go. Okay. Who are there in the round up next? Okay. Deborah, let's go with you. I think yours was up next.
Yeah, I just had two questions. First, what was the name of the person that you said knew a lot more about frequencies that we can check into?
Del Hungerford. She's based in, I meet her in Seattle, but I think she's based in the next state along, which is, tell me, I don't know. Idaho or
Oregon, Idaho.
Yeah, across to the west, Idaho. So she's just on the edge of Washington State and Idaho, and she's a a classically trained music and a music teacher, and she's got some great information on her website where she goes into frequencies. She produces a lot of sound herself. She makes music using specific frequencies for purposes, which is great. I can recommend her stuff and her, what's behind it, without doubt. So, yeah.
Okay. Do you know how to spell that name?
Del, and Hungerford, as in hunger, and Ford, F-O-R-D.
Okay. Okay, great.
She actually.
My other question was, go ahead.
Yeah, she is part of this group actually, but I doubt whether she would have a problem if I gave you her email address so you can contact her if you wanted to. But you'll find her; she's available online.
I can look up her website.
Okay. Yeah.
The other question was about the intent that you can release with the sound of the bowl. Can there be a similar thing with playing an instrument?
Yeah. I think absolutely. I think intent can be released in many different ways. When you hug someone with an intent. Now that can be very different if you're hugging your wife or your husband, or if you're hugging your best friend, or if you're just hugging someone because you've just met them. Now the intent goes with the action to either intensify that action or not. And so I think when you play music, I would be looking to encourage anyone who's involved in worship or worship music or playing instruments or recording to engage their spirit in heaven and allow their spirit to direct what they do, to carry heaven through what they do, and to have a mandate for perhaps something specific through what they're playing or what they're doing, because I think that will carry a greater dimension of power authority with it when we do that. And I could pick up a guitar and strum a few chords. Probably no one would recognize what I was playing at all, but I would not have any musical skill, but I could still release an intent And if my lack of skill in playing a chord or a particular string didn't hinder someone from receiving the intent, it could still be passed, and I think, skilled people find it easier to do that because they know what they're doing, and it's a flow of their creativity. For me, just like playing a bowl, whatever, I could release an intent through all sorts of different things, but it wouldn't necessarily be who I am creatively, in the same way as someone who's a musician or skilled. The same thing would be painting. People you find now in a lot of conferences, you find people who are up the front and they have their easels and they're tuning into what's going on and they're just creatively releasing things. And I think within that, there is an intent that people can pick up when they look at that in a future date. Even though they might not have been there, they can pick up the intent, And, I tend to sort of tune into things like that. I remember I was in Seattle and there was a guy who was painting something or had painted something, and he was painting other things. And I looked into it and I immediately knew what it was. I knew it was relating to the court of the Lord and to things that were going on in the court of the Lord with angelic assignment and all sorts of things. And I said to him, why did you paint that? And he said, well, I had sort of some encounter, but I didn't know quite what I was doing. So I sort of talked to him about it, and he said, oh yeah, that sounds like it. So sometimes you can even pick up within that. And, I think people later on listen to music and it touches their emotions. They might actually be moved to tears. All that stuff, we are sensitive, we can become sensitive to things like that and actually see that much more focused, really, yeah. There you go. Okay. Lisa.
Here. Okay, so I'm new at this. I started about a year ago with the Engaging God series. I'm taking this a different direction. Everybody in this chat seems to be at the 400 level, and I'm at the 100 level. My question to you, Mike, my frustration that I have logged almost 1,000 hours on this website, and I am still prepping for the journey. And I wonder if you could give insight or advice. I find myself, every module I go through, I go through them at least 5 times. And then I sit there and I go, oh my goodness, I've got to work on this. Oh my goodness, I've got kings I've got to address. Oh my goodness, we got to go here, we got to go there. And I'm finding myself getting so bogged down that sometimes when I go to prayer, I'm like, I'm just going to pray the Lord's Prayer because that's what I did when I was 10. And I get really, I guess I'm just getting bogged down. Is there a recommendation? Should I just go through the modules and keep on trucking? Because I just want to work on every little thing that comes up at every little module. And I'm not even at base camp.
Okay. Yeah, I would sort of take a more relaxed approach to it and engage relationally. Don't go systematically or formulaically through something to try and work it all out and work it all through. Just engage God and allow him to show you which bits you need to focus on, when you need to focus on them, and enjoy the relational journey that takes you deeper into him. It's like the agenda here is to know him and therefore know ourselves through him. And yes, there's lots of material because there's lots of people at different stages who come from different directions on their journey. Some of them will need different things than others, so in the initial transformation series stuff, you can only teach something linearly. It's not a linear thing. So you don't have to go through, you listen to it linearly, but you don't apply it linearly. So you don't have to go through session 1, session 2 and do that and deal with that, deal with that, deal with that. You just like, okay, I'm a living sacrifice. Search my heart, oh God. Show me if there's anything you want to deal with, and I'll deal with it. But if you don't show me, I'm going to just have fun. Yeah, so, and it's got to be a relational process, not a formulaic or ritualistic one. And the purpose for everything is to engage God. That's the purpose. So although, you might have been at it for a year or so, I was at it for 15 years to get me to the point where I could engage God in a way where I could talk to him, hear him talk to me, and begin to engage visually into engaging him. It took me years, because I started from scratch. I didn't know what I was doing. God just told me to meditate, and I didn't know how to do that. So I just did my best using the Bible until that became, oh, I can hear the Holy Spirit speaking to me, or thoughts in my mind of this scripture or this meditative engagement, until I went to the next step was, okay, well, if I can hear the thoughts of the Spirit about a scripture, well, I wonder if I can just hear the thoughts of the Spirit by talking to him. So I sort of put a chair up and pictured Jesus there, or I didn't even think about picturing it. I just chose to talk to the chair, because I guess, he promises never to leave us or forsake us. So I wanted to talk to him. So it made sense to talk to, like I would talk to anybody else. So that's what I did, locked my door so no one would, come in and think I was, talking to an empty chair. But I just did it until I was able to receive the same flow of thoughts in conversation that I got in meditation. And meditation for me was meditating using a Bible scripture. That was the only understanding I had, So, although, learning to see and hear are key elements to it, for me, having a relationship, which means I can connect to God and have some sort of conversational relationship with him, is really, really important. Because then you can always take everything back to him you might see, or you might have a vision of, or anything else. Don't strive to try and see or have an agenda other than I want to engage God deeper. I want to know him more. I want heart-to-heart connection to him that is going to, transform me more than anything else. So just focus on the relationship. Spend the time listening, talking, and engaging, and just do that. Yeah, okay, cleansing your gateways and all that stuff can be helpful. Being able to do 2 things or 3 things at the same time will give you benefits later on when you're going to live in heaven and on earth at the same time and have to connect to them. But they're little exercises that maybe for some people, work, and for others, it may not be that point for them. That's okay. But it isn't just the material which really is important. It's the activating, giving the time to engage, allowing the time for God to speak to you, for you to learn to hear his voice, to train your senses to be more discerning to it, because that's really what it's all about. The exercises, I don't do any exercises. I just live, but you have to practice if you're going to get better at anything. That's just the way it is. But don't allow the exercises to become an end in themselves. See them as an opportunity to engage God, whatever that might be, whether it be opening your first love gate and engaging God on the inside, which is, generally where I encourage most people to start, because he's in there and he's knocking and basically has opened the door. Well, hey, there's a good place to start. Now, what you experience when you open the door may be very different from what I experience, and that's okay. You just have to relax and be and see what happens. You may just feel peace. You may feel all sorts of things. You may sense love. Now, obviously, what I'm trying to do is distill years of my journey down into some sessions that can help people not reinvent the wheel, if you like, but realize, hey, you can hear, you can hear his voice, you can talk to him, you can engage, and that can become normal part of your everyday life. But it's so much easier when you relax and you don't strive to, just rest. Now, we've added a session to the first module, which is a little meditation exercise called Meditation for Rest. And it's only the first 3 parts of 7, because some of the other parts probably need to be further along in the program. But essentially, it's what, as I was learning and I was doing a teaching on deconstruction and renewal of the mind, God challenged me over, well, how do you just do this? And I thought, oh, I never really thought about it. I am. So I engage, and but he sort of drew it back to what I actually really do is come to a place of rest every day. So I come to a place of love, joy, and peace. And from there, then I can find, do I have a mandate today? How am I going to outwork my destiny? What am I going to do to facilitate that? Being a living sacrifice and surrendering to that, not wanting to do my own thing. All of that comes out of a place of rest. If I'm doing all those other things other than in a place of rest, then I will be doing it in my own strength and striving for it. So I do this little exercise, which is based on experiencing love, engaging in joy, which means life takes on a different perspective, and then living from a place of peace, which means being at peace with people, which is living in forgiveness. And so and it's probably like a 10-minute little thing, but that might be a thing for you to go back and just look to engage in the love of God. That is the key for everything, because that's where everything flows out of, and God loves you whether you can see or hear at all. He wants you to experience that love, not based on whether you're good at this or whether you're 100 and everyone's 400. Everyone thinks that. If I was around Ian Clayton, I'd probably think that, because he'd be talking about stuff which is like, oh, okay, great, but it's okay. It's not a sprint, so enjoy the time of engaging God. That's the key. Don't set the agenda to get something out of this. Just set the agenda. I want to spend more time with God, and by doing these little engagements, that will facilitate that. And then what comes out of it will be a relational process that God knows exactly what you need in your journey, which is different for all of us. So don't get discouraged, and just take a sort of a little thing of, okay, I want to make sure the relationship is the focus. I think then you'll find it probably will be a little bit easier than trying to do it. I mean, I remember one person, when we had like 5 modules, they did 5 modules of teaching in a month, and then they sort of came back, oh, I finished, and it was like as if they wanted brownie points for doing it in a month. And I just said to them, well, how much of what you have heard is now part of you and is your lifestyle? And they were like, oh, well, none of it really. I said, well, you might as well have stayed in module 1 or in base camp until it was, because all the others are actually based on the ability to hear and engage. Otherwise, if you can't really engage or hear, then none of the others make any sense. You just get more frustrated because you try higher exercises, if you like, having not got the first ones in place, which does cause frustration for people. But people want to, I know everyone's keen because they want, oh yeah, I want to do this, I want to be this stuff, but it's so much easier just to relax and enjoy the journey, however long it takes. But that's why we don't encourage people to move on from base camp until they're confident, at least in hearing the voice of God and having a relationship which is two-way. Otherwise, you go on to the next module, and you go on to gateways and things like that, and well, you won't be able to hear Jesus talk to you about your gates or explain them or share them with you because you won't be confident in hearing. So, I think that, that area is the best. And, all of us can activate our imaginations. It's just the way they work is different for everyone. So, when I close my eyes and I think of a door, there are various doors that I can focus on. so I can focus on the door that's standing open in heaven because I've been through it a lot. I can focus on my front door. Now, when I activate my imagination to picture that door, normally I don't need to close my eyes because I'm engaging it, and I can describe it to you, but I'm not really seeing it as in, I'm trying to picture it. But if I try and activate my imagination, then, okay, well, here's my front door. I get a mental picture of it, and I can describe that too. I can describe the color. I can describe the steps that are leading up to it because I have a mental picture. Now, to be honest, it's more information that I can interpret rather than, a Hollywood moving film. It doesn't matter which way it comes, so long as you can interpret it. And that's the important thing, learning to discern how to interpret a flow of revelatory information that's coming to you through your spirit, sometimes with your soul, and what God is trying to impart. And some people sense, some people could describe their front door to me without even thinking about it, picturing it. Try just thinking about, oh, my front door is blue, or it's got the, and they'll describe it to you in a visual way. And if you're quite visual, you may be able to sort of picture what they're describing. If you're not, you'll just know that they've got a blue front door, but because they've told you. Now, at the end of the day, whether you saw it or they told you, does it really matter? And I think what matters is we get the discernment of what God is trying to engage us with rather than the way in which we get it. It's not so much how the message comes, as the fact that we receive the message. And that will be different for everyone. Some people are feelers and sensors. Some people are knowers. For me, I'm a knower. I know where I am and I'm there. I'm engaging it. Some people are visual and they see things. Not everyone who sees things knows what they're seeing. And quite often people who are, quote, seers are very, very vivid seeing things, and they want to know what it is they're seeing, and they ask someone to interpret it for them because they don't know. Well, it doesn't seem an awful lot of use seeing something and not really understanding it or knowing it. So you sort of putting together the hearing, the seeing, the sensing, being able to say, God, oh, what is this? What are you doing? And then having his thoughts say, well, I'm just showing you this, or this is about that. That becomes a relational thing, which is what the key to the whole process is, and the clue really is in the title, Engaging God, because that's really what it's about. Getting a deeper relationship with God by encountering him through the time we give to do that. So, yeah. All right. Okay. Henry. Unmute. Oh, don't know why you're not unmuting. You were unmuting earlier.
There he goes.
There you go. There you go.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I have another question about the oils and stuff like that. Kinesiology and pressure testing, is that, what do you think about that? Is that a kind of a viable way to discern regarding, oils, the need or use?
I know people who do that muscle testing. It's like what's being picked up and what discernment is needed to determine through that. Now, you get in history, one of the healing evangelists, William Branham, who did amazing miracles in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s. He tells that God assigned him an angel, and when he touched people, he felt the vibration that was in them, and he then told them what was wrong with them. And he felt the angel was with him to help him with that, but he was, touching someone and discerning something through the touch. Well, people could say, well, that's again all weird. Well, why? Why will people think that's weird? How did Jesus know what was wrong with people? You know, it wasn't natural, was it? You know, in some way, he discerned something. He even discerned when someone touched him and power went from him, because he discerned that energy was being drawn from him by somebody. I will see the woman touching the hem of his garment, but there are other occasions where it talks about, and he discerned power went from him. So there was something that he was engaged with, frequency or vibration, that he was discerning about it, which is okay. Now, again, I wouldn't just accept anybody doing one of those things without knowing who they are and what their philosophy was and whether they were rooted in a relationship with Jesus. And if they weren't, I wouldn't have anything to do with it. You know, not that I particularly, have anything to do with any of those things myself personally, because I don't necessarily need frequencies from oils, because I can generate my own, in a sense, and live from a place of health. But I'm not knocking the fact that others do use those things. I just think, like Reiki healing and all this sort of stuff, essentially it's laying hands on people and using energy. Well, that's exactly what Jesus said to do, but he didn't say do it with some Reiki underlying philosophy, which has been added to it, and therefore they're not doing it through Jesus, although that's not to say that God can't use it, because he can use anything, even a donkey. So sometimes God will use things. Now, I went to a New Age sort of holistic healing event, and I went to talk to the people who were in their little tents, and there were people who were using sound, there were people using music, there were people who were using light, and I went to ask them, what are you doing? How are you doing it? Do you know how you're doing it? Where's the energy coming from? And none of them really knew. And I didn't really discern that any of them had any negative, bad intent. So I think they were tuning into energy that is in creation and channeling it to touch people for a good purpose of healing them. Now, once I discerned what they were up to, I then would talk to them and say, well, do you want to know where the energy comes from? Do you want to know how to engage the source of that energy? And they were like, oh, yeah. I said, well, go to our tent and they'll pray for you and you will engage the source of that energy, which is God. And a number of them did, and a number of them encountered God and ended up in tears because they actually met the source of the energy they were using. Now, I don't believe that they had any negative intent. There were a couple of the people who very clearly had a negative intent. I could see the darkness. I could feel it, I could see it, and I knew that they were not there for good purposes. They were there to hook people into and leave negative deposits in what they were doing. And there was a very different heart to those people. So I do think it does come down to who's doing what. But a good friend of mine, she has muscle testing stuff. People using tapping to sort of touching points of the body, using tapping to energize and do things, de-stress. It works, and there's nothing wrong in the principle, but some people might be using that for other reasons. So I think it's discernment is the key in all those sort of things. I think the one that I probably do not have any comfort about is yoga. In that, in the yoga thing, in a sense, meditation, no problem. I have no problem with chakras and energy gates, because I believe God made us with a blood system and a lymph system and a nervous system and an energy system and a gateway system. But it's what comes in and out of those gates, or what you invite in and out of those gates, is the key. But when it comes to yoga, I have not found an intent that God had anywhere that is redeemable yet. And there may be, I just haven't discovered it. And I'm not comfortable with that, because the postures do, I think, link back to, and I was talking to someone who used to be involved in it in the last session, actually. The postures do tend to connect to some sort of Hindu or other gods, and they're, you know, and so I wouldn't advise anyone to get involved with that. If there are people doing Christian yoga and it's purely exercise or stretching or things, I don't think you have to use those postures that are related to potentially those particular things. And I know, you know, the whole Kundalini spirit and all that stuff, which potentially cause accesses through these sort of things. You know, having friends who've ministered to people that have set people free from what they got in doing yoga, I would be, again, cautioning people to use discernment in what they were doing. Because there's all sorts of exercises and different things you can do without necessarily going down the route of, you know, those postures which potentially may have unclear sources, let's say, you know. So, yeah. Okay, right. I better leave it there. I've got a